There's a version of a woman that exists on the other side of betrayal, not bitter, not cold in the way people often imagine, but genuinely, permanently different in ways that go far deeper than simple caution. If you're picturing someone who just got warier, checked her phone a little more, softened her trust by a few degrees, that's not actually what happens to a super empath once betrayal fully lands. What happens is closer to a complete recalibration of who gets access to her, on what terms, and for how long before that access can be revoked without a second thought. Let's start by understanding why betrayal produces such a categorically different result in her compared to what it produces in most people. Because the difference isn't about the severity of the betrayal itself, it's about what she was actually offering before it happened. Most people who extend trust are extending something that was always somewhat conditional, hedged, protected by an instinct towards self-preservation that never fully disappears even in their closest relationships. A super empath's trust before betrayal tends to be different, not naive, not unguarded in any careless sense, but genuinely, fully extended, built on a real, considered decision that this specific person had earned the depth of access she was offering. This matters enormously because it means betrayal doesn't simply disappoint a cautious hope, it violates a deliberate, carefully arrived at conclusion, and that distinction changes everything about what happens afterward. Here's the first thing that shifts, and it's worth understanding as the foundation everything else builds from. Her definition of earning access changes permanently, not just with the person who betrayed her, but as a general operating principle going forward. Before betrayal, access to her deepest trust and vulnerability was typically earned through consistent behavior over time. Genuine kindness, demonstrated reliability, the accumulated evidence of someone actually being who they claimed to be. This process, while not naive, still operated with a certain generosity, extending trust reasonably quickly once early evidence looked promising. After genuine betrayal, this process doesn't just become slower, it becomes structurally different. Consistency over time still matters, but it's no longer sufficient on its own. She now requires something additional. Evidence of how someone handles being told no, evidence of how they respond when they don't get exactly what they want, evidence of what happens when the flattering, easy version of the relationship encounters genuine friction. This evidence takes considerably longer to gather than the earlier, more straightforward pattern of consistent kindness, which means the entire timeline for earning her full trust extends significantly, sometimes for years rather than months. The second thing that shifts is her relationship to charm specifically. Before betrayal, genuine charm, warmth, wit, apparent emotional intelligence functioned as a reasonably reliable signal, something that generally correlated at least somewhat with the kind of person worth getting close to. After betrayal, charm gets systematically decoupled from trustworthiness in her mind. Not because she's become cynical about charm existing genuinely in good people, but because she's learned through direct, painful experience that charm and character are far less correlated than she once assumed. This means charm that would have once accelerated her trust now produces almost the opposite effect, a kind of heightened, deliberate scrutiny, because she's learned that the people most capable of genuinely devastating betrayal were often, not coincidentally, the most charming people she'd ever encountered. Here's the third shift, and it's worth understanding through a specific, concrete lens. She develops what we might call asymmetric forgiveness, the willingness to forgive ordinary human mistakes generously and quickly, paired with something close to zero tolerance for the specific category of behavior that constitutes betrayal, as she's come to define it. This distinction matters enormously because it's often misunderstood by people who assume post-betrayal caution means becoming generally harder to please, generally less forgiving across every category of conflict. What actually happens is more precise than that. She becomes, if anything, more patient with genuine mistakes, genuine miscommunication, genuine human imperfection, because she's learned to distinguish these clearly from deliberate deception or exploitation. But for that second category, the one that actually constitutes betrayal, there's no longer a learning curve, no longer a series of second chances extended while she figures out whether the pattern will repeat. The verdict, once betrayal is confirmed, arrives almost immediately, and it holds. Let's talk about what happens specifically if she does eventually re-engage with the person who betrayed her. because this scenario is worth understanding in detail, precisely because it looks so different from ordinary reconciliation, and misunderstanding what's actually happening in it can be genuinely disorienting for the person on the receiving end of it. Here's the fourth shift, and it's perhaps the most important one to understand if you're trying to make sense of why re-engagement, when it happens at all, feels so fundamentally different from what came before. Any relationship that resumes after genuine betrayal operates under an entirely new, permanently altered contract, whether or not that contract is ever explicitly named out loud. Before betrayal, the relationship likely ran on a kind of implicit, generous assumption of goodwill, benefit of the doubt extended automatically, ambiguous behavior interpreted charitably, small inconsistencies absorbed without much scrutiny because trust hadn't yet been tested against real evidence of its limits. After betrayal, even in relationships that genuinely do continue in some form, this implicit generosity is gone, replaced by something closer to a probationary structure. Not punitive exactly, and not something she's necessarily communicating explicitly or dramatically. Simply a different underlying operating system, one where trust is now something continuously re-earned through ongoing behavior, rather than something extended as a baseline assumption and only occasionally tested. This shift explains something that often confuses people who betray a super empath and then later find some version of the relationship resuming. Why does it feel so different now, even though she seems on the surface to have forgiven what happened? The answer is that forgiveness, for her, was never actually the same thing as returning to the previous operating system. She may have genuinely released the anger, genuinely stopped holding the betrayal as an active grievance she's punishing anyone with. But the underlying architecture of the relationship has permanently changed, and no amount of apparent forgiveness reverses that architecture back to what it was before. This is worth understanding as a distinct, separate thing from resentment. She isn't secretly still angry, waiting for an opportunity to punish. She's simply permanently operating with a different, more conditional structure than the one that existed before evidence proved it needed to change. Here's the fifth shift, and it's worth understanding specifically because it explains a pattern that can feel confusing if you don't understand the mechanism behind it. She becomes genuinely, remarkably good at detecting the early warning signs of a repeat pattern, often faster than anyone in her life, including the person exhibiting those signs, would expect possible. This isn't paranoia, and it isn't hypervigilance in the anxious, exhausting sense of the word. It's calibrated, accurate pattern recognition, built directly from real, painful, specific experience rather than from generalized suspicion. Small behaviors that would have registered as unremarkable before betrayal. A slight evasiveness in answering a direct question, a subtle inconsistency between what someone says and what they later do, a familiar quality to how a conversation is being redirected, now register clearly and immediately, precisely because she's already lived through the full, devastating version of exactly what these small signals eventually build toward. This is worth understanding as one of the more significant, permanent consequences of genuine betrayal. It doesn't just change her relationship with the specific person who caused it. It functions as a kind of permanent education, sharpening her perception for every subsequent relationship she'll ever have, whether or not those future relationships have anything to do with the original betrayal at all. Someone who dates her after this shift, entirely unrelated to whoever betrayed her originally, benefits from or is scrutinized by, depending on their own behavior, a level of pattern recognition that took real painful experience to build, applied now to them regardless of whether they've done anything at all to earn that particular level of scrutiny. Here's the sixth shift, and it's worth naming directly because it's often misunderstood by people watching from the outside. Her capacity for genuine warmth doesn't actually diminish, even though her willingness to extend that warmth without earned trust absolutely does. This distinction matters enormously, and it's easy to conflate the two if you're only observing her from a distance rather than understanding the actual mechanism at work. She hasn't become a colder, less loving person in any fundamental sense. What's changed is the gatekeeping around who gets access to that warmth, not the depth or genuineness of the warmth itself once it's actually extended. This means the people who do successfully earn her renewed trust after this shift often describe receiving something even more valuable than what they might have received before, not because her love has somehow deepened as a direct result of the betrayal, but because they now understand clearly that what they're receiving was genuinely earned rather than automatically given, which changes how it feels to actually hold it. Let's bring this together into what actually matters most, both for understanding a woman who's lived through this shift and if you recognize yourself as someone who's caused this kind of betrayal, for understanding exactly what you actually broke and why it isn't coming back the way it was. Here's the truth worth sitting with directly, because it's the piece that determines whether any of this shift ever gets misunderstood as something reversible through the right apology or enough time. What changes in her isn't a temporary defensive posture waiting to soften once she's convinced enough that this specific instance won't repeat. It's a permanent update to how she processes evidence and extends access, built the same way any genuine learning gets built, through direct, undeniable experience that overrides whatever more generous assumption came before it. You cannot argue someone out of updated evidence. You cannot apologize your way back to a version of trust that existed before that trust had ever been tested. What existed before was innocence, in the specific sense of not yet knowing what this particular kind of harm actually costs and what it actually looks like up close. Once that innocence is gone, it doesn't return, regardless of how much genuine remorse follows the betrayal that removed it. This is worth understanding as neither punishment nor bitterness, even though it might initially look like either from the outside. It's simply the honest, structural result of a mind doing exactly what minds are supposed to do when they encounter clear, painful evidence that a previous assumption was wrong. The super empath who extended full, generous trust before betrayal wasn't naive for doing so. She was operating reasonably on the information available to her at the time. The version of her that exists after betrayal, requiring more evidence, extending trust more conditionally, noticing warning signs faster and taking them more seriously, isn't damaged or diminished. She's simply accurately updated, carrying forward exactly the kind of learning any reasonable person builds after being shown clearly what someone they trusted was actually capable of. Here's what's worth understanding if you're the super empath living through this shift yourself. Recognizing this exact pattern in your own life after betrayal, whether recent or years in the past. You are not colder for having built this. You are not less capable of love, less generous, less genuinely warm than you were before. What you've built is discernment, earned through real cost, applied now with a precision that protects the very warmth it might otherwise seem from the outside to be restricting. This discernment doesn't diminish your capacity to love deeply. It ensures that capacity gets directed toward people who've actually demonstrated they're capable of holding it responsibly, rather than being extracted automatically by anyone charming enough to ask for it before they've earned it. If you're someone reading this who betrayed a super empath and is now navigating the aftermath, whether she's fully walked away or whether some version of the relationship continues under its new, permanently altered terms, I want you to understand something clearly. The version of her you're now encountering isn't punishing you for what happened. She's protecting herself appropriately from what you've already demonstrated you're capable of doing when you have unconditional access to her trust. If you're genuinely committed to rebuilding something real, the path forward isn't through convincing her to return to the old, more generous operating system. It's through consistently, patiently demonstrating over real time and through real tests of your reliability that this new, more conditional structure is one you're capable of honoring, not because you've earned back the old version of trust which no longer exists to be earned back, but because you're building something new on different terms that reflects what she now accurately knows to be true about what trust with you actually requires. She doesn't return the same after betrayal, not because something in her broke in a way that needs fixing, but because something in her finally, accurately updated to reflect reality as it actually is, rather than as she once generously hoped it might be. That update is permanent. It's also, in every meaningful sense, exactly what should have happened and exactly what protects her, and anyone who comes after, from paying the same cost twice. There's something worth addressing directly here, because it's a question that often surfaces once people understand this shift clearly. Does this permanent recalibration mean she'll never fully relax again, never fully experience the same effortless ease in a relationship that she might have known before betrayal taught her to be this careful? This deserves an honest answer because it matters enormously for how she carries this shift forward into whatever comes next, whether that's continued distance from the person who betrayed her or a genuinely new relationship entirely. The honest answer is nuanced. The specific quality of unguarded, immediate ease she offered before betrayal, the kind that extends full trust quickly, almost automatically based on early promising signs, genuinely doesn't return in that exact form. And it's worth being clear about that rather than promising a false return to some earlier, more innocent state. But something different and arguably more valuable becomes available in its place over enough time and enough consistent evidence, a deeper, more settled kind of ease that isn't naive, but that's built on something sturdier than early impression. This later ease, when it develops, tends to feel different in quality, less like automatic trust extended and hoped for, more like trust that's been genuinely tested and found to hold, which produces a security that the earlier, more innocent version, however warm it felt at the time, never actually possessed. She trades the fast, effortless trust of before for something slower to build but considerably harder to shake once it's actually established. This is worth understanding as the genuine trade-off underneath everything we've discussed throughout this entire piece. Not a simple loss, even though it involves real loss of something genuinely valuable, and not a simple gain either, even though what replaces it offers real, meaningful protection. It's both simultaneously, and she's allowed to hold both truths without needing to resolve them into a single, simpler story about whether betrayal ultimately made her better or worse off. Something real was taken from her, the specific unguarded ease of early unearned trust. Something real was also built in its place, a discernment and depth of security that, once established, tends to run deeper and prove more durable than what came before it ever could have. It's also worth naming something important for anyone currently in the early stages of rebuilding trust with a super empath after genuine betrayal. Patience during this process isn't optional, and it isn't something you're owed a timeline for. The specific pace at which she extends renewed trust, if she extends it at all, is calibrated entirely to her own accumulated evidence, not to your comfort with how long the process is taking, or your frustration at not yet having full access to the version of closeness that existed before. Rushing this process, pressuring her to move faster, treating her continued caution as evidence that she hasn't really forgiven you or isn't really trying, all of this tends to confirm exactly the pattern that produced her caution in the first place, because it demonstrates, in real time, an unwillingness to respect the terms she's actually operating under now, replacing the terms you might prefer she still be operating under instead. What actually moves this process forward, when it moves at all, is a specific kind of patient consistency, showing up reliably, especially in the moments that don't feel urgent or significant, especially when there's no immediate reward for doing so, especially across enough time that the consistency itself becomes evidence rather than performance calibrated for a specific, hoped-for outcome. This is worth understanding as genuinely difficult, precisely because it requires operating without the reassurance of knowing whether it's working, without the immediate feedback loop that made the earlier, more trusting version of the relationship feel easier to navigate. But it's also the only path that actually, honestly, leads anywhere real, because anything faster than this simply isn't earning the thing it's trying to access. It's attempting to bypass exactly the evidence-gathering process that her permanently updated trust now correctly requires before extending itself again. Thanks for watching. If you like video, please like, share, and subscribe.